Hi, I'm Jonah, and this is a Learn to Play tutorial for Blackbird, a classic Beatles song, one of my all-time favorites, and it sounds so good on the native flute, especially the deeper tone flutes, because it has that kind of mournful, wistful feel that the flutes also have. Now, I'd put this in the category of kind of a beginning, more intermediate level song to learn, because it has cross fingerings, and some of the sequences of notes kind of move kind of quickly, especially towards the end. That said, if you've been playing the flute for a little while and you haven't been playing with cross fingerings that much and you haven't really been moving your fingers that quickly, this might be a good song to start pushing yourself that way. And especially if you can play it at a really slow tempo and it still sounds great. Now, if you don't know the song, it's helpful when learning any song if you can hear the song and know the song, the actual song itself, because you have that in your head, and as you're playing it, you're hearing the melody, and the rhythms can come out a lot smoother in your tonguing, and the fingering becomes a little more fluid in that way. So if you don't know the song, I'd suggest going online and listening to it. There's a ton of versions online because it's that good. It's such a great song. Or you can listen to my renditions of it a couple times, and that'll give you a feel for it as well. Now I'm going to be playing this on a flute in the key of E, and it's a lower tone flute, but I think it'll sound great on a flute in a high tone. I've played it on A, and it sounds really sweet on A too. It has much more of a sweet tone to it, where this deeper tone has more of a melancholy. And I haven't played it on anything higher than a mid-tone A, like any of the high tone flutes. I think it would sound really good on those flutes too. It might need to be played a little quicker in order to really fill out with that flute, but maybe not either. Sometimes the high tone flutes can have that same feel when they're played with the right embouchure and the right breath pressure. They can have a real sweet, soft tone to them while still being higher in tone. So I'm going to play through the song once, and then I'll go through an introduction of how to use this tutorial, and then I'll move right into the tutorial itself, and then at the end I'll play another rendition of the song. Now, the easiest way that I find to learn songs is to work through them phrase by phrase. Now, phrases are like sentences. You put a bunch of sentences together to build a story. In the same way, you put a bunch of phrases together to build a song. Essentially, each time you pause to take a breath, you've completed a phrase. And because in the music we've added these breath marks, you can easily see that the phrases begin and end at each of these breath marks. I've also noted the number of the phrases using these italicized numbers, phrase 1, 2, and so on. As I walk through each phrase, I'll note anything that's unusual or particularly challenging in that phrase, and then I'll show you how to play it, and I'll play it at a really slow tempo. And at that point, I suggest pausing the video and working on that phrase until you have the fingerings and the rhythm pretty well down at that slow tempo, and then move on to the next phrase. Once you move through the whole song, I suggest going back to the beginning of the song and working through each phrase again. And each time you do that, your hands will memorize the fingerings a little bit more, and you'll memorize the rhythms a little bit more, and the song will get easier to play, and you can start bringing it up to tempo. These are the notes that some of you may not have played before, so when you come to these notes in the song, have some patience with yourself. It may take a little time to learn the transitions from the note before it to this note and to the note after it. I'll also talk more about these transitions and notes as we come upon them in each phrase. This is the sheet music for Blackbird, and the first thing I want to go over is how to flow through this sheet music, because it's not just a standard beginning to end. So as we move through the music, you'll notice that the phrase numbers in the beginning have two numbers, 1 and 4, 2 and 5, 3 and 6. And this is because there's a repeat. This symbol here, these two dots with the thin line followed by the heavy line, is a repeat symbol. And when you see this in a sheet of music, it means go back in the music to where you see the two dots again and start there and start from there and play through again. And then when you get to this symbol the second time, you just continue playing on through. So when we come to this repeat symbol here, we move back through the music to where the two dots are, and that just happens to be at the very beginning of this sheet of music. So we go back to the very beginning, and then we move through these phrases, and then when we hit the repeat symbol again, then the second time through, we just bypass it and go right through to the end of the song. So that's why phrase 1 is also phrase 4, because as we move through, we go through phrase 1, 2, 3, we hit the repeat symbol, we go back to the beginning, we're now at phrase 4, 5, and 6. So the other thing I want to point out is that when you look at the sheet music portion of it, the notation, there's a lot of 8th notes and 16th notes. There's a lot of lines going on, and it can look intimidating. It can look like it moves along really fast and there's a lot of really fast changes. But the way these notes work, or the way sheet music works, is it's all relative to the tempo. So if you're using a really slow tempo, then an 8th note is actually not that fast, and a 16th note is not that fast. And so I would suggest using a really slow tempo for this song, and it actually works really well at a very slow tempo anyway. So I'd start with that, and if you want to speed it up, I'd suggest speeding it up later, but start with a really slow tempo. This is the first phrase of the song, and it's a pretty straightforward phrase. The notes are basic notes that we all learn to play when we're first learning to play the flute. So there's not a lot of fast changes here. So the notes are pretty straightforward, and the rhythm is pretty straightforward. And if you know the song, you can sing it in your head in order to gain the rhythm. So it's Blackbird singing in the dead of night, ta 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 ta. So if you know it, it gives you the rhythm. If you don't, then you'll need to count out the notes in order to gain that rhythm. So I use a real soft tonguing on that phrase. Ta 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 ta. It's real smooth, because otherwise it tends to be a little harsh, and it feels, when you hear the song, Blackbird singing in the dead of night, it kind of all flows together already. So I use a real soft tonguing there. So experiment with that rather than a staccato ta ta, a real ta ta ta, barely hitting there. Give that a try. So this is the second phrase of the song, and in this phrase there's a note that may be new to some of you, which is this note here. And in this note you're opening up the third hole from the top, the third hole down from the top. And when you're learning the pentatonic scale, that first scale we all learn on the native flute, you're keeping that hole closed. It may even be covered with a leather tie that you need to take off. But if you haven't played with it before, you're going to need to teach your ring finger the dexterity of opening up while keeping other holes closed. So to do that, I suggest, one, just lifting and lowering that finger on its own. But then the next thing to do is go back and forth between this note and this note. And so you can just go back and forth, and playing it on the flute, back and forth, till your finger feels really comfortable opening and closing. And then the next thing to work on is the cross fingering of this, going from this note to this note. So if you haven't played with cross fingerings before, I suggest again working on the dexterity here. First without playing the flute at all, just actually watching your fingers and moving them back and forth. And then playing the notes, and then playing all four of these notes, going from this note to this note to this note to this note at a very slow tempo. And then just start speeding it up a little faster, a little faster, a little faster. And then once you feel comfortable with that, then just start working through the whole phrase. Now, as far as the rhythm goes, if you know the song, it'll really help. Take these broken wings and learn to fly. Ta 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 ta. So that really gives it to you right there. If you don't know the song, then you'll need to maybe clap this phrase out, clap out the rhythm, or maybe tongue it out like I just did. Ta 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 ta. And really work with it over and over again to start gaining the feel of it, so that as you add in the notation, you already have the feel of it and you can kind of flow through the fingering and the rhythm at the same time. Again, starting off really slow as you do that. This is the third phrase of the song. In the fingering, there's a lot of changes, but the changes are often consecutive notes, meaning one finger after another. And so that tends to make changes more straightforward to move through. Now the rhythm is pretty straightforward as well. The one thing to note is that there's the 16th note going to this dotted 8th note, and then you move on to just 8th notes. And so what that feels like is ta 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 ta. And so your 16th note is quick, and the dotted 8th note just holds a little longer than an 8th note, and then you move on into just the string of 8th notes there. And so instead of trying to think it out, what I tend to do is actually just tongue it out without even the flute, like I just did. Ta 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 ta, using the word ta. And that way I can catch it with my tongue and catch the feel of it. And then I can add it to the flute, and you're just playing one note anyway, so just play that one note, ta 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 ta, and you can gain the feel of it. Now because phrases 4, 5, and 6 are the same as phrases 1, 2, and 3, I'm just going to move on to phrase 7. Now phrase 7 is a pretty straightforward phrase. The one thing is there's this note here, which may be a new note for some of you again. It's the same one we saw earlier in phrase 2. Otherwise, the rhythm and the fingering are pretty straightforward in this phrase. So this is phrase 8, and it's the same as phrase 7. The only difference is that in the last note on phrase 7, you're holding it for 4.5 beats, and in this phrase, you're holding this last note for 3.5 beats. Now, unless you're playing, if you're playing with another person, or like in a band, it's very exacting, then that makes a difference. But when you're just playing on your own, it doesn't make that much of a difference. And what's really good to remember about playing songs, especially a song that's a specific song like this one, is that it wants to sound like the song rather than the exact thing that's written on the page. So at times it might actually feel there might be more feeling in it and feeling out the song rather than playing it exactly. Just depends on how it's been written and how you want to play it. So this is phrase 9, and it's the most challenging phrase in the song, and it's also kind of a distinctive part of the song, where the melody all of a sudden jumps up to this higher note and then kind of works its way back down. Now this note here, some of you may not have played before, and so you'll have to teach yourself the dexterity of this note, how to catch it with your fingers, but it's also an over the octave note, so you may need to use a more staccato, a real kind of a poignant tonguing, in order to get it to pop over the octave. And that depends on the flute. Some flutes do that easier than others, so you'll have to play with it on your flute to see what you need to do to get it to jump up to that high note. Now this next note is also a note that some of you may not have played before, and it's all the holes open. So what it comes down to on this note is how to hold the flute. And so it's a balance between your pinkies and your thumbs and your mouth and how to hold the flute between those. So play with that a little bit to get comfortable with opening up all the holes and just balancing the flute within your pinkies, thumbs, and your mouth. And then it's time to learn the sequence of notes, which is a challenging sequence of notes. It took me a little bit of time to learn just the dexterity of it, and then adding the rhythm into it as well. So what I'd suggest is first just do it without playing the flute at all, going really slow and just moving through the sequence, and then doing that quicker and quicker till your fingers are catching these notes pretty fluidly all the way through, and then adding the rhythm into it in order to get the whole phrase.